The auction had been running for 3 hours before anyone died. That was, by all accounts of those who attended Marchetti's private gallery events, a record. The gallery itself was everything old money pretended Chicago wasn't. 3 floors of Romanesque arches, marble so white it hurt to look at, and artwork on the walls that had been liberated from European estates during 3 separate wars. The guests matched the decor. Men in suits that cost more than most people's cars, women in gowns that moved like liquid silence. And underneath all of it, beneath the champagne and the Monet and the carefully maintained fiction of culture, the unmistakable current of criminal power, running like an underground river through the marble floors. Scarlett had been in position for 47 minutes. She stood near the east wall, a glass of champagne she hadn't touched sweating gently in her fingers, wearing a borrowed Valentino gown the color of midnight that her handler Agent Crow had selected because, in his words, it would help her blend in. Crow had never met anyone who actually blended into a room like this. You either belonged or you didn't. And the people in this room had radar for imposters that had nothing to do with fashion and everything to do with survival. She looked like she belonged. She'd spent 14 months making sure of it. Her cover was Sienna Marchesi, art consultant, minor Italian-American aristocracy, a woman with a family name that opened certain doors in this world without requiring her to be anyone's wife or anyone's enemy. She'd built Sienna Marchesi from the ground up. Bank accounts, travel history, a carefully curated Instagram account full of gallery openings and wine country vacations, references that would check out all the way to Florence. What she hadn't built was a plan for tonight going sideways. The sound came from the upper gallery. Not a gunshot, not yet, a single sharp crack, the sound of a body hitting marble, followed by a silence that spread outward through the room like a stone dropped in still water. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Champagne glasses paused halfway to lips. Even the string quartet in the corner lost a beat, the cello stumbling, finding nothing to land on. Then, from the grand staircase, Lorenzo Vitelli descended. Scarlett had studied his file for 18 months. Photographs, surveillance footage, second-hand testimony from informants who described him in voices that never quite stopped shaking. She thought she knew what he looked like. She had been wrong. The photographs didn't capture the way he moved. Unhurried, absolute, each step deliberate as a chess move. They didn't capture the quality of his stillness when he paused at the base of the stairs and surveyed the room, and they absolutely did not capture his eyes, which swept the crowd the way a lighthouse beam swept dark water. Methodical, complete, missing nothing. He was wearing a charcoal suit and no tie. His dark hair was shot through with silver at the temples. His jaw was clean-shaven, his mouth set in a line of perfect, devastating patience. He looked, Scarlett thought with a horror she refused to let reach her face, exactly like a man who had just watched someone die upstairs and found it only mildly interesting. He raised one hand. A single gesture, fingers slightly spread. Every one of his men in the room, and there were at least 8 that she'd counted, stopped where they stood. Like marionettes with cut strings, like a freeze frame. Then he spoke. "Back to your evening," he said, quietly, conversationally, as though he were commenting on the weather. "My apologies for the disruption." The string quartet resumed. Conversations restarted. Champagne glasses moved again. 20 seconds of absolute stillness, and then the room breathed and everything continued exactly as before, and nobody, not one single person in that elegant, criminal gathering, said a word about whatever had happened upstairs. Scarlett exhaled carefully and looked back toward the painting she'd been pretending to study. She needed 3 more minutes. 2, if she was efficient. The listening device in the hidden pocket of her gown needed to be placed in Lorenzo's private study on the 2nd floor. She'd established the layout, confirmed the window of opportunity during these events when his security ran thin. All she needed was to slip upstairs while attention was elsewhere. The disruption, horrifying as it was, had actually created exactly the opening she needed. She set her champagne glass on a passing tray and turned toward the side staircase. She made it 4 steps before the hand closed around her wrist. Not rough, not yanking, just present, firm. A touch that communicated with terrifying clarity that releasing her was not a consideration. She turned, Lorenzo Vitelli stood close enough that she could see the specific shade of his eyes. Green, yes, but not simply green. The color of sea glass. Old, worn smooth by decades of cold water. He was looking at her the way she'd seen him look at the room from the staircase. With total, unhurried attention. "You've been watching the east wall," he said. "For 47 minutes. His voice was low. Not a whisper. A voice designed to be heard only by the person it was directed at. The Caravaggio isn't that interesting. Scarlett's training told her to smile. To be Sienna Marchesi, politely confused, flattered, slightly charmed. Sienna Marchesi smiled. "I find old masters endlessly interesting." He didn't release her wrist. His thumb moved just slightly, tracing the inside of her pulse point. He felt her heart rate. She knew he felt it, because nothing in his expression changed, and that stillness was more dangerous than any reaction would have been. "Who are you, Sienna?" "No." Just that. One word. The same quiet tone. An erasure. He was looking at her the way men looked at puzzles they intended to solve. And something in her chest tightened with a fear she hadn't felt in years. Not fear of being caught. Something older. Something that had nothing to do with her badge. "Who are you, really?" From across the room she heard it. A man's voice, rough and careless, carrying the specific arrogance of someone who believed his position made him untouchable. One of Julia Nero's soldiers. She recognized him from her files. His hand closing around a woman's arm near the bar, the woman pulling back, her face white. Lorenzo's eyes moved, just for a second, just to assess. Then the soldier saw Lorenzo watching and started toward Scarlett with a leer that had no self-preservation in it whatsoever. "I've been looking for this one," he said in a voice thick with something ugly. "She wandered off from our table. Isn't that right, sweetheart?" He reached for her free hand. What happened next took 3 seconds. Lorenzo Vitelli moved. Not fast. Not the frantic speed of urgency. Smooth. The way water moves, filling available space completely and without effort. He stepped between Scarlett and Nero's soldier. He said nothing. He simply looked at the man with those sea glass eyes and the absolute stillness of someone who has decided an outcome and is simply waiting for reality to catch up. The soldier stopped, looked at Lorenzo's face, and went the color of old ash. Lorenzo turned back to Scarlett. His hand found the small of her back. The touch was proprietary, unmistakable, and somehow, infuriatingly, the warmest thing she had felt in 14 months of living as someone else. He turned to the room. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't project or perform. He simply spoke, at the same conversational volume he'd used on the stairs, directed at no one and everyone simultaneously. "She's mine." 3 words, quiet as a confession, certain as scripture. The room went dead silent. Not the polite pause of social decorum, not the hush of proximity, a total, absolute, breathless silence, every conversation stopping, every head turning, every person in that marble hall suddenly acutely aware of where Lorenzo Vitelli's hand rested and what his words meant in the language of this world. Julian Nero's soldier took 1 step back, then another, then turned and walked very quickly toward the exit. In the silence, Scarlett heard her own heartbeat. Lorenzo looked down at her. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something more dangerous than a smile. "You'll have dinner with me," he said. Still quiet. Still certain. "I don't," she started. "It wasn't a question, Bella." His hand at her back applied the gentlest possible pressure. "And you're not going anywhere." Her name, her real name, the name her mother had called her, the name on her actual birth certificate, was Scarlett Donovan. She had not been Scarlett Donovan in 14 months. She remembered who she was, the way you remember a language you haven't spoken in years, structurally, intellectually, with a kind of yearning distance. Scarlett Donovan had grown up in a walk-up apartment in Bridgeport, Chicago, the youngest of 2 children, born to a retired cop father and a woman who worked double shifts at a hospital pharmacy until her feet gave out. Scarlett Donovan had gotten a full scholarship to Northwestern, had graduated top of her class at Quantico, had spent 7 years being very, very good at becoming other people. None of that history helped her now. Lorenzo's private residence wasn't the Gothic stronghold her imagination had constructed during mission prep. It was a penthouse in the Gold Coast. Clean, spare, and devastatingly beautiful in the way of things that cost extraordinary amounts of money to appear effortless. 12-foot ceilings, walls of glass overlooking a city that glittered like it was apologizing for something. Furniture that belonged in museums, positioned with the eye of someone who understood space and how power occupied it. She was given a room, a suite, she corrected herself, because calling it a room understated its dimensions, and a set of ground rules delivered by Enzo De Luca, who had the body of a Roman statue and the energy of a Labrador retriever who had recently discovered espresso. No phones, Enzo said, counting on his fingers. No going out unaccompanied. No trying to bribe any of us. We're very well paid. It's insulting, and Lorenzo gets annoyed. No going near the East Wing, the office on the second floor, or the safe room, all of which you can locate through basic deduction but will regret approaching. He smiled at her, genuinely, unexpectedly warm. Meals are at 8, 1, and 7. The kitchen is available all hours. We have an excellent cook named Johnny who will be devastated if you don't eat. Any questions? Am I a prisoner? Scarlett asked. Lorenzo calls it protective custody. What do you call it? Enzo's smile remained exactly where it was, but something shifted behind his eyes, a brief acknowledgement of the real question beneath the question. I call it the most comfortable cage in Chicago. He turned at the door. For what it's worth, he doesn't do this. This, he gestured vaguely at the suite, at her, at the entire unprecedented situation, isn't something he does. Whatever you are to him, you're something new. He left her alone with that. She stood at the window for a long time, looking at the city she'd spent her adult life learning to navigate, and ran through her situation with cold precision. Her listening device was still in her gown, which was in the wardrobe untouched, because Lorenzo's household had provided her with clothing that fit as though it had been purchased, knowing her exact measurements. She would think about that later. She filed it in the category of unsettling things about this man that was already running long. Her handler would have eyes on Marchetti's gallery. When she didn't check in, she was already 40 minutes past her window. Crow would make a call. That call would determine whether her cover held or whether the FBI decided she was compromised and started managing the situation around her, which meant managing her. She needed to find Lorenzo's study. She needed to plant the device. She needed to do it before Crow started making decisions on her behalf. She needed to stop thinking about the exact weight of Lorenzo Vitelli's hand at the small of her back. She'd been trained to notice the physical, to use it. Attraction was a tool, a proximity mechanism, something you deployed consciously and controlled completely. She had gone on dates with targets. She had let men think she was interested. She had never, not once in 7 years, felt the attraction land on her like something real. She turned away from the window, found the ensuite bathroom, marble and heated floors, and a soaking tub that could fit 3 adults, and turned on the cold tap and leaned over the sink and let the water run over her wrists until her pulse slowed. He's a criminal. She held the fact like a stone in both hands. He runs the largest Italian crime organization between Chicago and New York. His family has operated in the city for 3 generations. His name is attached to 14 unsolved homicides, 2 federal conspiracy charges that never made it to trial, and the disappearance of a federal witness in 2019. He killed your brother. That last one always worked. She pressed it against the warmth in her chest like ice against a bruise. He killed Danny. She dried her hands, straightened her spine, became Sienna Marchesi again, because Scarlett Donovan was too dangerous to be right now. He was waiting for her in the dining room. The table was set for 2. Candles. Not romantic candles, she noted, but practical ones, positioned for light. The kind of detail that said this was a man who had grown up with electricity but preferred fire. Johnny had sent out something that smelled of rosemary and garlic and slow-cooked wine, and despite every professional instinct she possessed, her stomach made a sound of pure betrayal. Lorenzo stood when she entered, a habit of old-world courtesy that sat strangely against everything else she knew about him. He'd changed. Dark trousers and a black shirt, collar open, no jacket. The informality was somehow more dangerous than the suit. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the gallery. That complete, patient attention, and gestured to the opposite chair. "Sit," he said. "I prefer to stand," she said. The corner of his mouth. That almost not quite a smile. Sienna. Her cover name in his voice sounded wrong, and she suspected he knew that. "Sit. Eat. Eat. You're my guest. Your guest doesn't have a phone. My guest is safe. That's more valuable than a phone." Safe from what exactly? He settled into his own chair, filled her wine glass with a Barolo that she could see from across the table was at minimum $200 a bottle, and looked at her with those sea glass eyes. "Sit," he said again. Still quiet. Still certain. "We have things to discuss." She sat. Not because he told her to. She told herself that. He studied her over the rim of his glass for a long moment. "Do you know who sent that man tonight? The one who reached for you?" She kept her face neutral. "No." He didn't believe her. She could see it. Not suspicion, exactly. Something more precise than suspicion. Pattern recognition. "His name is Salvatore Greco. He works for Julian Nero, and he was not reaching for you because he found you attractive." His eyes didn't leave hers. "He knew who you were. More specifically, he knew who you were pretending to be and why." The cold moved up her spine so fast she couldn't hide the small shift in her breathing. Lorenzo watched it happen. Said nothing. "What do you want?" she asked, and her voice was steady. She was proud of that, held on to it like a lifeline. "Answers," he said, "but not tonight." He lifted his fork with the same deliberate ease that marked everything he did. "Tonight I want to have dinner with you without either of us pretending the other is something they're not." He looked at her, a look that somehow saw through Sienna Marchesi and found the woman underneath, and held her gaze from across that small distance with a warmth that was more threatening than anything cold. "Can we do that?" "I own the terms of my own evening," she said. "You own a great many things, Bella." The almost smile again. Dangerous. Honest. "For now, eat. You're too thin for someone with your energy." She picked up her fork. Told herself it was tactical. Told herself everything about the situation was tactical. Told herself the warmth in her chest was a lie she was still working on believing. "You're not going anywhere," he'd said at the gallery, as she ate rosemary lamb across from the most dangerous man she'd ever been in a room with. She thought, for the first time, that he might be right. She hated that most of all. Chicago had 47 active crime families of varying levels of organization and ambition. One ran the city. The Vitelli family had operated in Chicago since 1924, when Lorenzo's great-grandfather Aldo had arrived from Naples with $12 and a talent for making people disappear that proved extremely useful during Prohibition. 3 generations of violence, loyalty, and political maneuvering had built an empire that was, technically, entirely legitimate. Import-export, commercial real estate, restaurant groups, a private security firm, a charitable foundation that donated generously to Chicago's Police Benevolence Fund and 4 city council members' election campaigns. Technically legitimate, demonstrably not. The real currency of the Vitelli Empire was control. Territory, not geographic, not in the old sense of street corners and neighborhoods, but vertical. Ports. Distribution channels. The specific, unglamorous architecture of how things move through a city. Every shipment that came through the port of Chicago had a number on it. That number determined which of 40 routing companies handled it, which of those companies held insurance through one of 6 brokers, which of those brokers paid their premiums through exactly 2 financial services firms, both of which reported quarterly earnings to a holding company registered in Luxembourg, and the holding company was Lorenzo's. Scarlett had spent 3 months learning this architecture before going under. She could trace the money 6 layers deep. What she couldn't trace was the evidence that would make it prosecutable. The conversations, the handshake agreements, the verbal orders that never touched paper and left no record anywhere that a warrant could reach. That was what the listening device was for. That was why she was here. She told herself these things while standing in the penthouse kitchen at 5:40 in the morning, watching Johnny make espresso with the focused religiosity of a man performing a sacrament, and trying not to think about the conversation she'd had with Lorenzo last night that had lasted, inexplicably, 3.5 hours. He had asked her about art. Not to impress, not the performative display of culture she'd expected from a man who kept Caravaggios on his walls. He'd asked, like someone who was genuinely curious, who had been looking at the same paintings for 20 years and wanted a second perspective. She'd answered as Sienna, had deployed Sienna's carefully constructed expertise, and somewhere in the second hour she'd stopped thinking about what Sienna would say, and started saying what she thought, because he was asking real questions and her training had never adequately prepared her for this specific kind of attention. He noticed the shift. She'd seen it in his eyes. A small, satisfied recognition, like a man who has been patient a long time and been rewarded for it. She had ended the evening by standing, thanking him for dinner, and walking to her room with every shred of composure she still possessed. "You're up early," Enzo said from the doorway of the kitchen, already dressed, holding his own espresso like it was a weapon. He looked at her with bright, intelligent eyes that she was learning not to underestimate. "Lorenzo's been up since 4. Does he sleep?" "Couple hours. Sometimes." Enzo settled onto one of the kitchen stools with the ease of a man at home. "He doesn't sleep well, hasn't in years." He paused, added carefully, "Since his brother." She filed that, carefully, alongside everything else she was collecting. What happened to his brother? Enzo was quiet for a moment, not reluctant, considering. Federico was the good one, the one the family was going to send to law school, keep clean, let run the legitimate side. 26 years old, he was killed by Julian Nero's men in 2018, 3 days before his wedding. Enzo's face didn't change, but something behind it went very still. Lorenzo buried him in the family plot in Rome and came back and dismantled Nero's entire Chicago operation in 72 hours. Businesses, properties, soldiers, all of it gone. The FBI called it a gang war. It was surgery. He looked at Scarlett. Julian Nero has been rebuilding for 6 years. And he has a very long memory. She absorbed this quietly. "Why are you telling me this? Because you should understand who you're dealing with." Enzo met her eyes directly. "And because you should understand that the man who claimed you last night in front of everyone who matters in this city, he doesn't make careless gestures. He hasn't made a single careless gesture in 6 years. He stood, took his espresso. "Whatever game you're playing, Sienna," he said the name the same way Lorenzo did, as a container for something else. "Be careful of what you win." He left. She stood in the kitchen with that hanging in the air, and then turned as she heard footsteps. Lorenzo, he was in running clothes, black, simple, and he was clearly just returned from outside, his hair slightly damp despite the November cold, his breathing even in a way that suggested the run had been long. He looked at her in the kitchen with those sea-glass eyes, and something in his expression softened, just barely, the way stone softens in water, imperceptibly, over time. "Coffee," he said, and it wasn't a question. Johnny was already moving. He sat across from her at the kitchen island. No table, no formality. This morning, for the first time, he looked almost human, almost approachable, more dangerous for it. "I need to talk to you about last night," she started. "You mean the part where Julian Nero's man tried to take you, or the part where you spent 3 hours being someone other than who you've been pretending to be?" She went still. Lorenzo wrapped both hands around his espresso cup and looked at her steadily. "Scarlett Donovan," he said quietly. 29. FBI. 14 months undercover. Your handler is a man named Crow who I've met twice and disliked considerably both times. He paused. Your brother was Danny Donovan. He died 11 months ago. His voice didn't change, but something in it did. Something subtle and certain. I'm sorry for your loss. The world went very white and very quiet. She was on her feet. The stool went back. Her hand found the knife block on the counter before her training even consciously registered the movement. One knife handle turned toward him, Because her actual weapon was in her room and this was what she had, Lorenzo didn't move, didn't react. Just watched her with those eyes. "Say that again," she said. "I'm sorry for your loss," he repeated, with exactly the same inflection, as if the knife weren't there, as if she weren't shaking. "You knew?" Her voice was very quiet, very level. The most dangerous thing in the room, suddenly, was her. "You knew who I was. Since Tuesday. 3 days before the gallery. You were identified to me by..." He stopped. Something moved across his face. A decision being made. That's a longer conversation. One I intend to have with you, but not while you're holding a knife. Give me one reason not to use it. "I haven't harmed you," he said. "I could have. At any point in the last 72 hours, I could have made you simply stop. I didn't." He met her eyes. "Put the knife down, Scarlett, and let me tell you what I know about your brother. All of it, including what you don't know." The knife stayed where it was for 4 more seconds. Then she set it on the counter, not because she trusted him, because she needed what he had, and because something in the room, in this strange pale morning, in the way he looked at her with terrible knowledge and complete calm. Something felt like standing on the edge of a truth she had been running from for 11 months. "Tell me," she said. Outside, in the gray November city, a car sat in the shadow of the building opposite. The man inside had a long lens camera and a Vitelli family dossier with Scarlett Donovan's photograph on the cover. He lifted a phone. Sent a single text. "She's burned. Proceed with contingency." In a glass office 40 floors away, Agent David Crow read the message and made a call. She had known, in the abstract, that Danny was gone. The body had been identified, a warehouse fire on the south side that had consumed everything inside it. Her supervisor had delivered the news with the careful, practiced neutrality of someone reading from a script. She had been taken off active duty for 3 weeks. She had sat in her apartment and not eaten and let her phone ring unanswered, and then gotten up, on the 22nd day, and requested reassignment to the Vitelli case, because Danny had been informing for the FBI when he died, and she had always, in the part of herself she didn't examine, believed that his death was connected to Lorenzo Vitelli. She had been right about the connection. She had been wrong about everything else. "Your brother was recruited as a confidential informant 18 months before his death," Lorenzo said. They were in his study now, the room she'd originally been sent to plant a device in. He'd simply walked her there himself, which she found so profoundly absurd that she'd nearly laughed. "Recruited by Crow. Are you aware of the specifics of what he was providing? Organizational intelligence. Shipping routes, meeting schedules." She kept her voice flat. "That's what Crow told you." Lorenzo set a folder on the desk between them. "Open it." She opened it. It took her 4 minutes to read through the contents. By the end, her hands were perfectly still on the paper because she couldn't afford anything else. Danny had been providing intelligence. But not just to the FBI. The information he'd been feeding through Crow had also been routed, through 3 intermediaries and a secure drop in Luxembourg, to Julian Nero. Nero had been using that intelligence to identify and eliminate Vitelli soldiers before Lorenzo could deploy them. 7 men had died in the 18 months of Danny's cooperation. 7 men with families, 3 of them with children. Crow was running a double feed, she said. Her voice was very quiet. Crow was running a war, Lorenzo corrected her, using your brother as the weapon. Whether Danny knew the full scope of what was being done with his information. He paused. "I don't believe he did. He was 23. He was in debt. He had a romantic idea of what working for the FBI would mean." His voice stayed level, but she heard something in it that she hadn't heard from him before. Care. The careful handling of a truth he knew was going to leave marks. "He wasn't evil, Scarlett. He was used. And you killed him anyway." The words landed between them like stones into deep water. Lorenzo was quiet for a long time. "My men executed a fire that they believed, based on intelligence I received, was a Nero ambush site." He met her eyes. "That intelligence was provided to me by someone I trusted, someone who knew your brother was there, someone who made certain my men would be sent to that location. He paused. I am telling you that your brother's death was a targeted operation, and I was the weapon used to carry it out. The room was very still. Who gave you the intelligence? She asked. He didn't answer immediately, and in his hesitation, she read something enormous, a name he wasn't yet ready to speak, a trust so deep that even its betrayal hadn't fully been processed. I'm still confirming, he said finally. When I'm certain, I'll tell you. I give you my word. Your word, she repeated. My word is the most valuable thing I possess. He said it simply, without performance. Ask anyone who has ever received it. She stood and walked to the window. Chicago spread out below them, gray and vast and indifferent, doing what cities do, moving, regardless of what broke inside the buildings above it. She had built her entire adult life on a narrative. Lorenzo Vitelli had killed her brother. She would bring him down. She would do it for Danny, and for justice, and for the clean satisfaction of an account settled. The narrative was gone. In its place was something much more complicated, much more dangerous, and much more true. She felt him before she heard him move, felt the warmth of him as he came to stand beside her at the window, close, not touching, just present. You came here to destroy me, he said, not an accusation, an observation. Yes. How long has it felt wrong? She closed her eyes. Since Tuesday, the same day he'd known who she was. A long silence. The city moved below them, indifferent and constant. I need you to understand something, Lorenzo said, and his voice was lower now, stripped of the formal cadence he used in rooms full of people. Just a man's voice, speaking to a woman, in a gray morning in a city that had eaten everyone they'd both ever loved. When I said what I said last night, in front of those people, it wasn't strategy. It wasn't protection. Though it was also that. A beat. It was the most honest thing I have said in 6 years. She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her. His hand came up, slow, deliberate, giving her every opportunity to step back, and touched her face. His thumb traced her cheekbone with a gentleness so completely at odds with everything she knew about him that her breath caught audibly. I don't know what you are to me, he said quietly. I have never in my life said something I didn't know the shape of. I cannot name this. He looked at her with those old, careful eyes. But I know what I felt when Nero's man reached for you, and I know what I feel right now. Lorenzo, let me say this once. His hand stayed at her face, not holding her. Just there. I have spent 6 years being exactly what this world made me. I have not regretted a single choice because I made each one with full knowledge of what it cost. I regret Danny Donovan. I will carry that. His jaw tightened, then released. And if you need to hate me for it, I understand. I will still keep you safe. Because you're the only person who has looked at me in years and seen something other than what I want them to see. And that is, his voice dropped to almost nothing. Irreplaceable. She should have stepped back. She didn't. His mouth found hers. Not the way she'd imagined. Not a possession or a statement. Soft. Certain. Like a question asked by someone who already knew the answer and was asking anyway because some things deserved to be spoken aloud. She kissed him back, and the part of her that had been Sienna Marchese for 14 months, the careful, strategic, entirely controlled part, simply, completely let go. When they broke apart, his forehead dropped to hers. His eyes were closed for once. Just for a moment. A man allowing himself something he hadn't allowed himself in a very long time. I'll burn the world for you, he said. The quietest possible declaration, if that's what it takes. Below them, completely unknown to both of them, a black SUV with FBI plates pulled away from the curb. Agent Crow pressed his thumb to his phone, authorizing a new operation. The operation was called Extinguish. The target was Scarlett Donovan. The Vitelli family dinner happened every Sunday. This had been true for 3 generations. Rain, war, federal investigation, and once, memorably, a significant flooding event in 2013. that had required moving the proceedings to the third floor. Donna Lucia Vitelli had been cooking the same recipes for 40 years, and she viewed the weekly dinner with the seriousness of a religious obligation, which in the Vitelli understanding of things it essentially was. Scarlett was told about this tradition on Friday. She was told she was attending on Saturday. She spent Saturday nights staring at the ceiling and thinking about the fact that 48 hours ago she had kissed a man she came to arrest, and it had felt like the first honest thing she'd done in over a year. "You look like you haven't slept," Enzo said Sunday morning, appearing in her doorway with espresso and the cheerful lack of social boundaries that she was beginning to understand was simply his baseline. "Thank you, Enzo, that's helpful." "Donna Lucia notices everything," he said, settling into the chair by the window with the ease of a man who treated all spaces as equally his own. "She will know you didn't sleep. She will make certain assumptions." He sipped his espresso. "Those assumptions will not be wrong, which will make it worse." "Nothing happened," Scarlett said. Enzo looked at her with those bright, knowing eyes. "In this family, nothing is always the thing that means everything." He stood. "Wear the green dress, it brings out your eyes. Donna Lucia likes people who understand color." He was, infuriatingly, correct on both counts. The family home was in Lincoln Park, a historic Victorian that had been in the Vitelli family since 1947 and had been renovated exactly once in 1991, at Donna Lucia's insistence and to her precise specifications. It smelled of tomato and basil and old wood and the specific, comforting smell of a house that had held decades of the same family. Photographs lined the hallway. Generations of Vitellis in their Sunday best, stiff and dark-eyed and entirely themselves. Scarlett stopped at one photograph. A young Lorenzo, mid-20s, she estimated, standing next to a boy several years younger, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. The younger one had Lorenzo's eyes. "Federico." He laughed more, then, Lorenzo's voice said behind her, and she didn't startle. She was getting better at sensing him, which was either a survival mechanism or something more complicated. He stood beside her, looking at the photograph with an expression of clean, unguarded grief. Federico thought everything was funny. He had the gift of finding the absurd in the serious. A pause. "It's a gift I've never had." "You find things interesting," Scarlett said. He glanced at her, surprised. "You look at things, including me, like they interest you." "That's a version of the same gift." She held his gaze. "It's just quieter." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You are going to be very dangerous to me." "I was always going to be dangerous to you," she said. The method was just different. Something that was absolutely, undeniably a real smile crossed his face, brief as summer lightning. Gone before she could fully catalog it, Donna Lucia Vitelli found them in the hallway. She was 70 years old and 5'2", and she stood in the doorway of her kitchen and looked at Scarlett with eyes that were her son's eyes in an older, sharper face, and conducted a full evaluation in approximately 4 seconds. "You haven't eaten enough," she said. "Mama." Lorenzo started. "I'm not speaking to you," Donna Lucia said pleasantly. "I'm speaking to your guest." She turned back to Scarlett and extended both hands, a gesture of welcome so genuine it ached somewhere deep in Scarlett's chest, in the place where her own mother had lived. "Come, I'll feed you. Then you can tell me what my son has done to put those shadows under your eyes." Dinner was 4 courses and a revelation. She met Lorenzo's cousin, Matteo, 20, charming, trying too hard, and an uncle named Carmine who told stories that were either fictional or federal crimes and delivered both with equal relish. She watched Lorenzo move through his family with a quietness that was different from his professional stillness. Softer, less armored. He refilled his mother's wine glass before she asked. He corrected Matteo's account of a business deal with the specific patience of a man who has been correcting the same person for years and has made peace with the ongoing project. He caught her watching once, the almost smile again. After dinner, when the plates were cleared and the grapple was out, a sound from the back garden made every man in the room stand simultaneously. A sharp, particular sound. The sound of a fence struck hard by something heavier than the wind. Lorenzo was already moving. "Stay," he said to Scarlett. She did not stay. She followed, through the kitchen, through the back door, into the garden, where two men she didn't recognize were moving along the fence line in the dark with the careful, deliberate movement of professionals. One of them had a weapon drawn. She processed this in 3/4 of a second, took 2 running steps, hit the ground in a controlled roll that brought her up behind the rear man, and had his weapon arm locked at an angle that made functioning it impossible before Lorenzo's own people had fully cleared the doorway behind her. Silence. The man in her hold made a decision. She felt it, the shift of weight as he calculated his options, and she applied additional pressure to the lock before he could act on it. "Don't," she said quietly. Lorenzo stood 3 feet away, looking at her. The held man looked at Lorenzo. "She's FBI," he said, and his voice had the specific quality of someone reporting this as relevant new information. "I know what she is," Lorenzo said. He stepped forward, took the man by the collar, and moved him to where 2 of his soldiers were waiting. He turned back to Scarlett, who had straightened and was breathing evenly and absolutely refusing to feel proud of herself. Lorenzo looked at her for a long, specific moment. "Nero's scouts," Enzo said from the doorway, his voice stripped of its usual warmth. "3rd time this month. Take them somewhere and ask them questions," Lorenzo said, without looking away from Scarlett, politely, at first. Enzo's expression suggested the politeness would be brief. When they were alone in the garden, Lorenzo stepped close to her, close enough that she could see the tension in his jaw. The way his control was slightly frayed at the edges tonight in a way she hadn't seen before. "You could have been hurt," he said. "I'm trained." "I know." He touched her face, the same gesture as before, thumb at her cheekbone, but different tonight, rougher at the edges. A man trying to hold himself together by touching something real. "I know you're trained. I know you can handle yourself. I know." He exhaled. "And I still what?" "Couldn't breathe," he said simply, "until I saw you were whole." She covered his hand with hers. On the back of his left hand she'd noticed before there was a scar, old silvered, a thin diagonal line from his knuckle to his wrist. She traced it, not asking, just acknowledging that it existed. "Blood oath," he said quietly, seeing her trace it. "Traditionally, Vitelli men mark themselves when they take control of the family. The cut is made, blood on the family seal, the promise spoken." He paused. "I was 31. Federico was 20. His voice was steady. "He held my hand while it was done. He said, 'You'll be the best of us, Enzo.' He always called me that when it was just us, using our father's name as a joke." He looked at the scar. He was wrong about a lot of things. He was right about that one. Scarlett understood, suddenly and completely, that this man had loved his brother the way she had loved Danny. Not perfectly, not without complication, but absolutely. She understood something else too. Both of them had been weapons in a war they hadn't started, and somewhere in the city, the man who had started it was still breathing. "Lorenzo," she said, "the person who gave you the intelligence. About Danny. About the warehouse." She held his eyes. "You know who it is?" "You've known since before you told me." A very long pause. "I need more proof," he said. "Who?" she pressed. He looked at her, looked away, looked back. A man who had carried this alone for weeks, maybe longer, and was at the end of what alone could hold. "Marcus," he said, low, almost below sound, and she watched Lorenzo Vitelli, the quietest, most controlled man she had ever met, look for just a moment, like a man who had been betrayed by his own heartbeat. She took his hand. Both of them stood in the November garden while the city breathed around them, and neither of them spoke, because some things were too large and too awful for language, and all you could do was hold someone's hand while they absorbed the shape of it. "Tomorrow," she said finally, "we figure out tomorrow." His hand tightened around hers. "Yes," he said, "the ambush came on a Tuesday. It came the way the best ambushes always do. Not in the dark, not at the expected moment of vulnerability, but in the honest light of mid-morning. On a street Scarlett had walked with Lorenzo twice that week, in front of a coffee shop called Bianchi's that had nothing to do with Marcus Bianchi, and everything to do with the fact that someone had spent considerable time watching their patterns. There were 4 of them. Nero's men, she'd learned later. She processed the threat in the same moment Lorenzo did. They both stopped at the same instant, body language clicking into alert, the half-second of pre-violence that trained people recognize as a specific quality of stillness in the humans nearby. 3 seconds. The first man raised his weapon. Lorenzo moved. She moved. He went left. She went right. And something in her brain noted with distant clinical approval that they moved without consulting each other, without a signal, filling space as though they'd been doing this together for years. She dropped behind a parked car, came up in a combat stance, assessed 4 hostiles, 2 positions, Enzo 10 meters back and moving up fast. Lorenzo was already between her and the primary shooter, which made her furious in a way that became something else entirely when she understood what it meant. He put himself between her and the gun. Enzo took the 2 on the right. Fast, efficient, economical. The way Lorenzo's men always worked, like violence was a problem to be solved and not a drama to be performed. Lorenzo took the 3rd man, and Scarlett took the 4th before Enzo could get there, because the 4th man was circling around the back of the car and heading directly for her with a weapon and a purpose, and she was the daughter of a cop and the product of Quantico. And she was done. Being the thing that was protected. 4 seconds of violence. 3 men down, not dead, but comprehensively unable to continue. The 4th was pinned against the car with her knee in his back, and his wrist at an angle that was having a conversation with the pain receptors in his spine. Silence. A coffee cup, abandoned on the sidewalk, rolled slowly against the curb. Lorenzo stood 3 feet away, breathing evenly, looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before and would spend a long time after trying to adequately describe. Not surprise. She'd moved past surprising him. Not just admiration, though that was there. Something rawer than both. Something that had to do with a man recognizing his equal in a world where everyone around him was either subordinate or enemy. "Clear?" Enzo called. "Clear," Lorenzo said, without looking away from her. He crossed to her in 3 steps, took her face in both hands, and she had perhaps 1 second of not warning. Not enough for warning, just the single heartbeat of "oh," before his mouth came down on hers with a conviction that had nothing to do with the first kiss's careful gentleness. This was something else. This was a man who had watched someone try to take what was his and was expressing a very specific biological and emotional response to that event. She kissed him back with equal intensity. Her hands found his shirt when they broke apart, Enzo making a pointed noise behind them that they both ignored. Lorenzo pressed his forehead to hers, eyes still closed, breathing harder than the fight had made him breathe. "Mine," he said. Not loud, lower than his usual quiet. A sound vibrating in his chest. "Tell me you understand what that means." "I understand what it means," she said. "I'm still thinking about whether I'm going to let it stand." He opened his eyes. That absolute, almost smile, wider now than she'd ever seen it. "Let it stand," he said, voice low, "because you are mine, and I am." A brief hesitation. A man who had not said this in a very long time finding the words again. "I am yours. Completely, whatever that means, in whatever world you need it to mean." He held her gaze. "I love you, Scarlett Donovan. I have no strategy for telling you that. I have no context in which it makes sense or is safe or is anything other than exactly what it is." He exhaled, "I love you, and I will spend the rest of my life making certain you are never in the position of having to prove yourself to anyone again." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about Quantico, about Danny, about 14 months of being someone else, about the gallery, the quiet claim, the room going silent, and the feeling, that traitorous, terrifying feeling that had landed in her chest at that moment and never left. "I love you," she said, quietly, completely her own. "I came here to destroy you, and I love you. I'm going to need a minute to be complicated about that." "Take as many minutes as you need," he said, and tucked her against his chest, and she let him, right there on the Chicago sidewalk with Enzo very carefully studying the middle distance and 3 of Julian Nero's men lying unconscious on the pavement. She had precisely 27 minutes of being in love with Lorenzo Vitelli before Marcus Bianchi answered his phone. And war became inevitable. 3 days after the ambush, Matteo Vitelli was shot outside his university. He survived. The bullet caught his shoulder, not his chest. Either bad aim or a deliberate message, and the family's disagreement about which it was split along generational lines, with a bitterness that told Scarlett everything about how the Vitellis handled fear. Donna Lucia went pale and silent in a way that was more frightening than screaming. Lorenzo went to the hospital, sat with his cousin through the surgery, and when Matteo was out of danger and sleeping, walked into the hospital corridor and stood very still for a very long time with his hands in his pockets. Scarlett found him there. "It was supposed to be me," he said when she stopped beside him. "Matteo was wearing my coat. He borrowed it because he stopped, because he wanted to look older." She didn't offer comfort. She understood he wasn't looking for it. "Marcus knew your schedule," she said. "Marcus has known my schedule for 30 years. His voice was very level, too level, the quality of voice that preceded the particular kind of violence that couldn't be called back. He's been feeding it to Nero since." A pause. "Since before Federico. Possibly since before that." His jaw worked. "I trusted him. He was my father's consigliere. He taught me to read a balance sheet. He told me to name my first child Federico after my brother, to honor him." He stopped. He was feeding Nero's men the address of Federico's apartment when Federico died. The silence in the hospital corridor was absolute. "Lorenzo, I need 3 things from you," he said, turning to look at her. Those sea glass eyes were completely clear, completely focused. He was the calmest she had ever seen him, which was the most frightening version of him she had encountered. "I need your word that you won't contact Crow. I need your word that when this is finished, when Marcus and Nero are finished, you will let me show you that there is a version of this life worth living." He paused. "And I need to know you're beside me, not behind me, not protected, beside." She held his gaze. "I'm beside you," she said. "You have my word on all 3. He nodded once. Turned back to the corridor. "Good. Then let's go end this." The next 48 hours moved like a long thunderstorm, all pressure and dark accumulation before the break. Lorenzo called a sit-down with the 3 other family heads who held territory adjacent to his, not to ask for support. The Vitelli family didn't ask, but to inform them that the Nero organization was being dismantled in its entirety, and that their continued non-involvement would be honored as they had always been. None of them argued. She watched 3 men who between them controlled most of the organized crime on the eastern seaboard look at Lorenzo and simply agree. No negotiation. No counter-demand. They agreed and left, and she understood in that room what his power actually was. Not violence, not money. The absolute certainty that he always meant exactly what he said. Marcus Bianchi was brought in on a Wednesday evening. She wasn't present for that conversation. Lorenzo had asked her not to be, and she'd respected it because she understood what it was to have a reckoning that needed to be private. Enzo was there. 2 senior soldiers. And Lorenzo. She heard nothing from behind the study doors for 2 hours. When Lorenzo emerged, he looked exactly as he always did. Unhurried, collected, the sea glass eyes calm. He was carrying a phone. "He's confirmed everything," Lorenzo said. "And he's given us Nero's location." He looked at the phone. "He also gave me the full recording of the briefing Crow ran when he placed you on this assignment." His jaw tightened. "Crow knew you were Danny's sister when he sent you in. He intended for you to be either his leverage against me or his justification for moving on me directly, whichever was more useful." He looked up. "You were never going to walk out of this operation with your career intact. That was never his plan." She absorbed that. "Where is Nero?" she asked. "His compound in Evanston." Lorenzo put the phone in his pocket. "Tonight." "And Marcus?" A very brief pause. "Marcus is being managed," Lorenzo said, and something in his tone closed a door on the subject with absolute finality. She understood. She didn't press. They were moving troops when Enzo came to find her, face serious in a way she'd never seen it. The Labrador Retriever energy entirely gone. "There's a problem," Enzo said. "The men Crow had watching the building. They're moving." multiple vehicles. The FBI isn't just watching anymore. He held her eyes. They're coming for you. She felt it, not panic, something colder and more useful. Clarity. How long? She asked. 20 minutes, maybe less. She turned to find Lorenzo already watching her. Tell me what you need, he said. I need 10 minutes alone with a phone, she said. I need to call someone who isn't Crow. A pause. A calculation. Then he handed her his own phone. Use mine, he said. I trust you. She looked at the phone in her hand, his phone, given freely in this moment of crisis. She understood the enormity of it. She dialed. The call connected on the second ring. Assistant Director Harmon, said the voice on the other end. This is Special Agent Scarlett Donovan, she said. Badge 7741. I need to report a compromised operation, a corrupt handler, and a joint homicide targeting that I have evidence for. I need witness protection for myself and one civilian, and I need it in the next 15 minutes. She paused. And I need you to pull a leash on Agent Crow before he creates an international incident. A silence. Agent Donovan, said Assistant Director Harmon. Where are you? She told him. When she hung up and turned, Lorenzo was watching her from the doorway. He had heard everything. His expression was unreadable, and then, slowly, it became readable in a way she hadn't expected. He was proud of her. Good call, he said, from outside, distant, getting closer. She heard the sound of multiple vehicles. They're early, Enzo said, appearing behind Lorenzo. Lorenzo didn't turn to look. He looked at Scarlett. Go to the safe room, he said. Second floor, behind the bookcase. You know the one. I'm not hiding. I know, he said. I know you're not. That's not what I'm asking. He came to her, took her face in both hands, pressed his mouth to her forehead. Not a kiss, not quite. Something more fundamental than that. A man marking what was precious to him. I'm asking you to be safe while I handle the approach. And then I'm asking you to come out when it's time and be exactly who you are. Can you do that? She could. The next 3 hours were the most complicated of her career. Crow's team hit the front. Lorenzo's men were not there. They were already gone. Through routes that Crow's surveillance had never identified. Through tunnels under the Gold Coast that had been used by every generation of Vitellis since 1947. The FBI descended on an empty penthouse while, across the city, Lorenzo moved his people into position around Julian Nero's compound in Evanston. An assistant director, Harmon, authorized a field operation that no one in Crow's chain of command had been briefed on. Crow sent her a text that made her skin crawl. Come out now or I'll bury you. She showed it to Enzo. Enzo photographed it, forwarded it to Harmon, and said, This guy is so fired, with the satisfied certainty of a man who had access to considerably more damaging material. Then her phone rang. Lorenzo's voice. We have a problem. She heard the sound of the gun before he finished the sentence. Lorenzo, she said, and her voice was perfectly even, and her blood ran ice cold. I'm fine, he said immediately. I'm fine. But Nero, he's not at the compound. Where is he? A pause. She heard Enzo's voice in the background, low and urgent. He's coming here, Lorenzo said, and he has. His voice changed. Just slightly. Not much. Just enough. He has 3 of my people, including a woman. The woman's name, she would learn in the next 60 seconds, was Gianna, 22, the housekeeper's daughter. She had been in the building when Crow's team arrived, had been separated from the evacuation, and Nero's men had taken her before Lorenzo's people could get to her. Lorenzo, Scarlett said. I know, he exhaled. I know, I'm coming. But she heard in the background the sound of another phone ringing, heard Enzo say a single word, the kind of word that meant something had gone very wrong. Lorenzo, she said again. Static. The call ended. She stood in the safe room, behind the bookcase, second floor, exactly where he'd asked her to be, and she looked at the phone in her hand and she thought, not a chance. She moved. He'd known risk his entire life. He'd been born into it the way some children are born into music or mathematics. As a native language, the structure through which all other experience was filtered. His father had taught him to assess a room before sitting in it. His uncle had taught him that the most dangerous people were the ones who had nothing to lose. His first mentor, Marcus, always Marcus, had taught him that information was the real weapon and everything else was just theater. And then Marcus had used all of that against him. Lorenzo sat in the back seat of the SUV, listening to Enzo lay out what had happened in the last 20 minutes, and he was very, very calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that preceded the kind of violence he generally preferred to reserve for people who had done something genuinely unforgivable. Julian Nero had Gianna. He had 2 other Vitelli associates, and he'd sent a message, literally a handwritten note, because Nero had always had a theatrical quality that Lorenzo found annoying, that laid out his terms with elegant simplicity. Scarlett Donovan, in exchange for the 3 hostages, by midnight. He thinks she's your weakness, Enzo said, voice flat. She is, Lorenzo said. Enzo went quiet. The difference, Lorenzo continued, is that she's also capable of handling a weapon, understanding a tactical situation, and making decisions under pressure. She is not a weakness in the sense Nero intends. He looked out the window at the dark streets moving past. His mistake is treating people like leverage. It never accounts for what they'll do when they decide they're done being leveraged. What Scarlett did, when she decided she was done, was leave the safe room and go directly to a man who owed Lorenzo a significant favor, and who happened to have access to everything Nero's note had contained, because it had been scanned and sent to 3 of Lorenzo's lieutenants before it reached his hands. And those lieutenants had digital records and tracking software, and Scarlett had learned, in 14 months of living in this world, exactly how the information architecture worked. She found Nero's secondary location herself. She called Enzo from a burner phone she'd sourced from a drawer she absolutely wasn't supposed to know about, read him the coordinates, and said, "I'm already here, come fast." Enzo looked at his phone. Looked at Lorenzo. I heard, Lorenzo said. Drive faster. What they found at the secondary location, a warehouse complex east of Evanston. The kind of industrial space that looked abandoned and functioned as anything but, was a situation that had, in the interval between Scarlett's call and their arrival, changed significantly. 2 of Nero's external guards were unconscious. The side entrance had been breached, professionally, not by force, but by a lockpick, which was information about Scarlett Donovan that he filed for later. Inside, 2 more men were down. She'd been moving through the building. They found her on the 3rd floor, in a standoff that had the architectural quality of something assembled under time pressure and significant improvisation. She had one of Nero's senior men at gunpoint, a man named Costa, who was worth considerably more than most of the people in the building, because Costa had been at Nero's right hand for 12 years and knew every secret worth knowing. She had positioned herself behind a structural column with lines of sight on both exits and a clear view of the room where the 3 Vitelli hostages were being held. She had not been seen. She was waiting. Lorenzo came to the east door. She didn't look at him. Kept her eyes on her sightlines, but said, very quietly, "Costa, right side. He'll make the call that opens the hostage room. Don't kill him yet." "Yet," Enzo murmured, almost to himself, with the tone of a man discovering something wonderful. And then, Julian Nero appeared. He came down from the upper level with 4 men and a smile that belonged on something that had too many teeth, and he looked at the assembled scene. Scarlett behind her column, Lorenzo with his people spread through the room, Costa being very still, and he laughed, an actual laugh, genuine, surprised, delighted. "I see why you claimed her," Nero said. He looked at Scarlett with an expression that made every person in the room want to put something sharp in him. "I've been trying to get a clean shot at Lorenzo for 6 years, and she found this place in 40 minutes. He shook his head. "Remarkable. Genuinely remarkable." Then the laugh stopped. "It doesn't change anything. You're still going to give her to me, or I'm going to start taking things from you one at a time until you have nothing left." Lorenzo looked at him. Just looked at him. "Julian," he said quietly, "don't. You killed my brother." The room was absolutely silent. "I've waited 6 years to say that to you directly," Lorenzo continued, in a voice so controlled it was barely a voice at all, just sound shaped by complete certainty. "I want you to hear me say it. You killed Federico. You used Marcus to do it. You used the young man's desperation to arm yourself. And then you used my own loyalty against me." He paused. "And now I'm going to take everything from you. Not because I'm angry, because it's owed." Nero reached for the woman beside him, a leverage instinct, the action of a man who had always won by making other people pay, and was still moving when Scarlet fired, not at Nero, at his hand. His weapon dropped. And then Lorenzo moved. Later, she would not be able to account for all of it precisely. It was very fast and entirely efficient, and she had seen violence before, but not like this, not the complete, purposeful dismantling of a position by a man who had been waiting 6 years for this specific moment. 4 of Nero's men went down. Enzo handled 2 more. Costa, calculating his survival odds, hit the floor and stayed there. Nero ran. She was faster. She hit him at the base of the stairs, a full-body tackle that she'd last used in a training exercise at Quantico, which, she saw it distantly while her shoulder connected with his torso and gravity did the rest, had apparently made a lasting impression. They went down together, and she came up with her knee in his back and her weapon at the base of his skull and her voice absolutely level as she said, "You are under arrest. You have the right to remain silent. I strongly recommend you exercise that right." Nero was very, very still. From behind her, she heard a single exhale. Lorenzo's exhale, the specific sound of a man releasing something he'd been holding for 6 years. When she stood, when Nero was secured and the hostages were out and Enzo was on the phone with what appeared to be 6 different people simultaneously, Lorenzo came to her and put both hands on her face and looked at her with those sea glass eyes. And she saw there what she had come to understand was his version of completely undone. Not tears, not shaking, just that total, certain stillness turned on her. Nothing else in the world. "You," he said. "Me," she agreed. "You went alone." "I know. I would have. I know," she said again more gently. "But it wasn't faster with help, and they needed help faster." She put her hands over his. "I'm whole. I'm whole. And here and yours, Lorenzo, I'm yours." His forehead came down to hers. "Never again," he said. "We'll argue about that later," she said. And despite everything, the bodies, the blood, the 6-year reckoning finally met, the FBI sirens that were already audible in the distance, Enzo laughed, and the sound bounced off the warehouse walls and filled up the space. And even Lorenzo, forehead still pressed to hers, exhaled a single breath that was almost a laugh. Almost. The papers called it a joint FBI and organized crime task force operation. Assistant Director Harmon was very good with language. Joint operation was technically accurate in the sense that both parties had been at the scene, and both had participated in the outcome. The fact that the participation had been sequential rather than coordinated, and that the FBI's contribution had largely consisted of arriving after the significant decisions had been made and securing a man who was already on the floor, was a detail that Harmon's press release handled with admirable creative omission. Crow was suspended pending investigation within 24 hours. The full extent of his involvement, the double feed operation, the deliberate compromising of Scarlet's cover, the authorization of what would later be formally documented as an extrajudicial action against a federal agent, took 6 weeks to unravel and resulted in charges that wouldn't be resolved for 2 years. Scarlet gave her full testimony twice. Both times she told the complete truth, including about Lorenzo. This was the part that kept her awake for 3 consecutive nights. She sat in the kitchen of the penthouse, which had become, without formal discussion, simply the place she lived, and she turned the problem over and over in her hands like something she was trying to understand the weight of. She was a federal agent. She had evidence about his operations. Not all of it admissible, not all of it clean, but she knew things. And she had made a choice, 14 months ago, to pursue this case in a specific direction, and that direction had led her here, to a kitchen at 2 in the morning, drinking tea and trying to figure out how to love someone she had once wanted to destroy. He found her, as he always found her. She suspected he tracked her by the specific quality of silence that indicated she was somewhere thinking about something impossible. He sat across from her, waited. "I have to make a report," she said. "I know. A full report. Everything I gathered, everything I observed." She met his eyes. "I can't protect you from it. I won't falsify federal testimony. That's a line I won't cross. I know, he said again. Exactly the same tone. I'm not asking you to. She stared at him. You're not worried. I'm worried about a great many things, he said. Your safety, the welfare of my people. Whether you slept last night, which, he looked at her, clearly you did not. He folded his hands on the table. My legal status is managed by 4 attorneys who have spent 30 years constructing a very elaborate series of protections. What you gathered during an unauthorized undercover operation that will now be associated with a corrupt handler is, he paused, considering, less than optimal for prosecution. She blinked. Crow's contamination is your contamination, Lorenzo said simply. Everything collected under his authorization is tainted. Your cover identity, your access, your placement, all of it was predicated on an operation that is now formally under review for corruption. He looked at her steadily. I'm not free, Scarlett. I never will be entirely. But I am also not going to prison because of evidence gathered in service of a man who was working against his own agency. He paused. My attorneys were quite clear on this point. She leaned back in her chair. Something she'd been carrying for 3 days shifted, slightly. And Nero? She asked. Has considerable evidence against him, gathered by sources and methods, entirely separate from yours. He almost smiled. My own attorneys were also helpful here. She looked at him for a long time. You've been managing this since before I kissed you, she said. I've been managing this since before I claimed you, he corrected. A pause. The legal situation is manageable. What is not manageable? Something in his voice changed, became the low, stripped-down version she'd learned to recognize as his most honest register, is the idea of you leaving. I'm not leaving, she said. He looked at her. I resigned this morning, she said. Put in the paperwork before I made coffee. She held his gaze. I spent 14 months being someone else. I'd like to spend the next 14 years being myself. A pause. With you. If that's... Yes, he said, no hesitation, no qualification. Yes, she laughed. It came out unexpected, genuine and slightly undone, the kind of laugh that happened when something you'd been braced against simply wasn't there. He watched her laugh with those sea-glass eyes, and something in him looked so unbearably, quietly happy that it rearranged something fundamental in her chest. He reached across the table and took her hand. There's one more thing, he said. His thumb moved across her knuckles. Nero's trial will take 2 to 4 years. During that time, his organization, what's left of it, will be unstable. Men without a leader make rash decisions. He met her eyes. It won't be safe for some time. I know. You don't have to stay for the hard part. Lorenzo. She turned her hand under his, gripped it. I took down 4 of his men alone in a warehouse in Evanston. I think I've demonstrated my appetite for hard parts. He looked at her hand in his. At the contrast of their knuckles, her pale skin against his darker, scarred hands. He turned their joined hands over and pressed his mouth to her palm. Not a kiss, not a possession, just the warm press of his lips to her skin, like a man touching something he was grateful for. One of us might die tonight, she had said, what felt like years ago in that warehouse. It was over. They were whole. He looked up at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, Lorenzo Vitelli looked entirely, simply, unguardedly glad. It's finally over, she said softly. He shook his head, the not-quite smile all the way to a real one now, rare as winter light. It's finally starting, he said. Julian Nero's trial took 19 months. Scarlett testified on day 4. She wore a dark blue suit and told the truth in a voice that didn't waver once. And Lorenzo sat in the public gallery 2 rows back and watched her with the focused attention of a man who finds something so worth watching that he doesn't need to look anywhere else. She'd felt him there, hadn't looked back, hadn't needed to. The charges were extensive. 19 counts including RICO violations, conspiracy to commit murder, 2 counts of murder in the first degree, extortion, and the charge that Herman's office had been most careful about and most determined to make stick, the federally prosecuted murder of Federico Vitelli, established through Marcus Bianchi's testimony and 3 years of financial records that Harmon's team had been building independent of Crow's corrupted operation. Marcus testified in exchange for a reduced sentence that would still mean he died in prison, given his age. He sat in the witness box and gave his testimony in the same measured, elegant voice he'd used to discuss strategy across 30 years of Sunday dinners, and he looked, once, across the courtroom at Lorenzo. Lorenzo looked back. Nothing changed in his face. His eyes didn't soften, and they didn't harden. He simply looked, acknowledged, let Marcus carry the full weight of what was being carried, without adding to it or diminishing it. She'd asked him about it afterward. "Was that for him or for you?" she said. He'd thought about it carefully. "Both," he said finally. He needed to know I saw him clearly. And I needed to stop seeing him as the man I thought he was, and see the man he actually was. A pause. They're different people. I was grieving the first one for years without knowing it. The verdict came on a Thursday afternoon in late October, 2 years after the warehouse in Evanston. Guilty on all 19 counts. Nero received 4 consecutive life sentences and would spend his remaining years in a federal facility specifically designed for organized crime kingpins. Scarlett was in the courthouse corridor when she heard the verdict read through the open courtroom doors. She stood very still. Around her, Lorenzo's lawyers were already on phones, already managing the documentation, already thinking 6 steps ahead the way Lorenzo's world always moved. Enzo was grinning like a man who had been waiting for this specific moment and intended to enjoy every second of it. Lorenzo came to the courtroom doors. He saw her immediately, crossed to her in 3 steps. And he did something she had never seen him do in any public setting, something that she suspected the handful of witnesses present would discuss for years. He pulled her into his arms, in the middle of a courthouse corridor, and held her. Just held her. Both arms, completely, with the particular intensity of a man who has been through something enormous, and has come out the other side and has arrived at the only place in the world that feels like rest. She held him back. "For Federico," she said quietly, against his chest. "For Federico," he said. "For Danny. For all of them." Enzo, behind them, made a sound that was suspiciously close to a sniffle. Then said, loudly, "I'm not crying. There's something in my eye. There is something in my eye, and I would appreciate if everyone would mind their own business." Nobody minded their own business. But it was over. And the after, the real after, the one she'd been building toward without fully letting herself see it, was finally, completely here. The penthouse had changed in the 2 years of after. Subtly, slowly, the way things change when someone lives in them rather than occupies them. A reading chair had migrated from the guest suite to the living room window because the light was better there. The kitchen had acquired a tea selection that Lorenzo would never drink, and Johnny treated as a personal educational challenge. There were photographs on a shelf that hadn't been there before. Not professional portraits, nothing staged. Just the accumulation of actual life. Donna Lucci at Sunday dinner laughing at something Enzo had said. Matteo at his graduation with Lorenzo's hand on his shoulder. A photograph she didn't remember being taken of herself and Lorenzo on a pier in Lake Geneva. Their backs to the camera. Her head on his shoulder. Both of them looking at water. She loved that photograph. She loved the way it was entirely ordinary. The way they looked like people who had simply always been there, beside each other, looking at the same thing. Donna Lucia was the first person who knew. Not because she was told. She knew because she looked at her son during dinner one Sunday in early December and saw his eyes when they followed Scarlett across the kitchen. And she reached across and took Lorenzo's hand and said, "Finalmente." Finally, he'd smiled at her. Actually smiled. And Donna Lucia had turned to Scarlett and said, "You know, I always said he needed someone who didn't look at him like he was dangerous. He needs someone who looks at him like he's worth something." A pause. "You look at him like he's worth everything. I like you very much." Scarlett had felt that land somewhere permanent. The proposal, if it could be called that, which she later decided was both inaccurate and perfectly accurate, happened on a Tuesday evening in January. She'd been at the Vitelli family home for a meeting with Donna Lucia about the charitable foundation. which had expanded significantly and which Scarlett had been quietly helping to reorganize since her resignation from the FBI had left her with professional energy and no outlet. Lorenzo was in the study. She stopped in the doorway on her way out, and he was standing at the window, his back to her, and she said his name, and he turned and walked directly to her. No hesitation, no performance, no stage setting. And he took her left hand and he looked at her and he said, "Marry me." She looked at him. That's it? Was there something missing? Traditional proposals have. Scarlett. He held her left hand in both of his. The same scar on the same knuckle, silver and familiar. I don't have a speech. I have this. I want to spend the rest of my life waking up and knowing you're beside me. I want to build something with you that is genuinely good. I want to give you something that is yours, that nobody can take, that has nothing to do with crime or cover identities or federal testimony. His thumb moved over her knuckles. I want to be your husband, if you'll let me. A very brief pause. I did buy a ring. It's in my pocket. I can produce it. Something in his face softened. Wanted to ask before showing it to you, because the question matters more than the object. She looked at him for a very long time. "Lorenzo Vitelli," she said. You are the most infuriating, terrifying, unexpectedly wonderful person I have ever met in my entire life. I'll have that engraved." "Show me the ring," she said. He produced it from his pocket, not a box, just the ring. Loose, which was somehow exactly right. A cushion-cut emerald. Green as sea glass, old, warm, set in platinum, flanked by 2 small diamonds that were there not for show but for structure. She recognized it immediately as old. "Family. My grandmother's stone," he said. "Donna Lucia had it reset. She did it 6 months ago, she told me." He met her eyes. "She knew before I said anything." "Of course she did," Scarlett said. He held it out. She took it. Looked at it in her palm. "Say it," she thought. The old Lorenzo voice in her head. A memory, an echo from a very different moment. "Say it. Let me hear you surrender," she thought. "I surrendered months ago. I just took a while to admit it." "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." He slid the ring onto her finger. He kissed her hand. He kissed her forehead. He pulled her close, and she went. And the ring was warm between them from being carried in his pocket, and outside the window Chicago spread in its January blue-white clarity, the lake visible on the horizon, the whole enormous city below them carrying on its business, indifferent and constant. Later, when Enzo found out and made a sound that was absolutely a sob before immediately demanding to know what position he would hold in the wedding party, and Donna Lucia held her face in both hands and said, "My daughter," in a voice so full of certainty that Scarlett felt it rewrite something in her foundation. Later, when she called the number she still had for her old partner from Quantico and said, "I need you to be a maid of honor, and I need you to bring the good whiskey because the story takes a while." Later, when she stood at the window alone for just a moment and looked at the emerald on her hand and thought about Danny, not with grief, not anymore. With something more complicated and more honest, a love that held both the light and the shadow of who he was, and who she was and what they'd both been. Later, all of it was true and whole and real, but right now, his arms around her, the ring on her hand, the city below. "Enough. More than enough. Marry me or I'll kidnap you again," he'd said, and she'd laughed, and he'd looked at her laughing like it was the most valuable thing he'd seen in decades. She was still laughing. 8 months later, the Vitelli family married in June, not a large wedding. Not the cathedral ceremony with a guest list of 200 that Donna Lucia had initially, optimistically, sketched out on her kitchen notepad. A private ceremony in the family garden in Lincoln Park, with 30 people who mattered, under an arch of white roses that Johnny had sourced from a grower in Lombardy because Donna Lucia had been to Lombardy on her own honeymoon and she intended to have an opinion about the flowers and exercise it. The priest was old. The ceremony was traditional, properly traditional, in the way of people who mean it. The Latin came back to Lorenzo, she saw. like a language he'd been speaking in his sleep, his voice low and unhurried and certain as it always was, responding to the ancient words with the same absolute conviction he brought to everything. She wore ivory, not white. Ivory, the color of old lace and family silver and things that had been used and were more beautiful for it. Donna Lucia had given her the veil, which had been in the family since 1952, and which Scarlett had put on in the upstairs bedroom while Donna Lucia watched with the bright, fierce eyes of a woman who has been waiting for this specific kind of morning for a long time. "You're not nervous," Donna Lucia observed. "No," Scarlett said, which was the truth and would have surprised her 2 years ago. "Good." Donna Lucia adjusted the veil with hands that were gentle and sure. "Nervous is for people who aren't certain. You're certain." She was certain. She had been certain, she realized, since a Chicago evening in an art gallery when a man with sea-glass eyes had taken her wrist with one hand and claimed her with 3 quiet words, and the entire assembled criminal world had gone. Absolutely, completely still. She had spent considerable time since then arguing with that certainty, examining it, looking for the flaw in it, the professional contamination, the trauma response, all the reasonable frameworks that were supposed to make it smaller or more manageable. It was not smaller. It was not manageable. It was simply true. She walked through the garden in the June morning light, and Lorenzo turned when she reached him. And what happened to his face when he saw her was something she would never be able to describe adequately and would never stop being grateful for. A man who had spent 6 years managing every reaction, maintaining every mask, allowing himself nothing that he hadn't calculated first, simply opening, like a window that has been shut against weather for too long and is finally allowed to let in the light. He took her hands. "You're here," he said, quiet as always, more raw than she'd ever heard him. "I said I would be," she said. He lifted her hands and pressed his mouth to both. "Bella," he said against her fingers. Enzo, standing at Lorenzo's left, was not crying. There was clearly something in his eye. He had mentioned this to 3 separate guests already. The ceremony was 40 minutes long. The reception in the garden went until midnight, at which point Donna Lucia declared it a success and retired, and the remaining guests, mostly Lorenzo's people, mostly people who had learned to extend their loyalty to include the woman who had walked into their world carrying a listening device and stayed to become part of their family, had another 2 hours of grappa and laughter and music from a quartet that switched, at some point, from Vivaldi to something that Enzo had apparently arranged because it was Scarlett's actual favorite song, which she had told him once and had apparently filed in the same place he filed everything important, permanently. She danced with Lorenzo. They danced the way they did everything, without performance, without stage, without any audience that they were conscious of. She had her head against his chest, and his hand was at the small of her back, and the garden was warm, with the kind of June night that Chicago occasionally, generously offered as apology for its winters, and she closed her eyes and listened to his heartbeat, which was steady and regular and completely, absolutely real. "Tell me something," she said. "What would you like to know? What were you thinking? In the gallery. Before you came across the room." A long pause. She felt the exhale through his chest. "I was thinking," he said, "that you'd been standing near that painting for 47 minutes, and you'd looked at everything in the room except the painting." He paused. "And I was thinking that whatever you were waiting for, whatever reason you were there, you were the most alive person in the room. And I had not been near someone genuinely alive in a very long time." He held her closer. "And I thought, whoever she is, she's going to change everything." She lifted her head, looked at him. "And?" she asked. "And," he said, sea-glass eyes warm in the June dark. "I was right." She kissed him. Not the gallery kiss, not the warehouse kiss, not any of the desperate, electric, life-or-death kisses of the year behind them. This kiss was something new. Slow, warm, belonging. The kiss of 2 people at the beginning of a long, uncomplicated, ordinary happiness. He held her face in both hands and kissed her back the same way. Around them, the garden breathed with summer. Somewhere in the city, the Vitelli Empire continued its careful, unglamorous operations. The ports, the distribution, The architecture of control that had been built over 3 generations and would continue under a man who understood power as responsibility. It was not a perfect world. It was never going to be a perfect world. But it was theirs. Complicated, blood-soaked, fiercely protected, and entirely, irrevocably theirs. When they finally stepped out of the garden and into the front hall, heading for the car and the rest of their lives, Donna Lucia was sitting in the front room in her best chair. Shoes off, a glass of wine on the table beside her, not quite asleep. She opened one eye as they passed. "Finalmente," she said again, the word that had been waiting. Lorenzo paused, looked at his mother with an expression of such complete, simple love that Scarlett had to look away for a moment, because it was too much to look at directly. "The way some lights are, finally," he agreed. And Scarlett Donovan. Scarlett Vitelli, now, with an emerald on her hand and a family she hadn't expected, and a truth she had been running toward without knowing it for her entire adult life, took her husband's hand, and they walked out into the June night, into Chicago, into whatever the world intended to do with 2 people who had found each other in the worst possible way, and chosen each other anyway with the full knowledge of what that choice would cost and carry. He looked down at her hand in his. She looked up at him. "You're not going anywhere," he said. Quiet. Certain. The same words. Different world. "No," she said. "I'm not." And the city breezed around them, indifferent and eternal, while the most dangerous man in Chicago walked into his future with the woman who had come to destroy him and stayed to build something neither of them had known they were capable of. Something permanent, something real, something theirs,